All right, welcome back, everybody. We are now on to the final section of Unit 6, the interwar changes, and we're going to look at the Great Depression, which is not just an American history event, it is a world history event that can have all kinds of ripple effects down the line, and that's how we're going to finish up our unit. Before we get to the Depression, however, we're going to take a moment to kind of look at what's going on in the world in terms of foreign policy. So we will get to the Great Depression, but first we're going to take a little bit of a detour and look at post-war foreign policy. And the question I have for you here is, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Can we ultimately eliminate all wars? Is that something that's possible? And so far in human history, it has not been possible. But with World War I being how destructive it was, there were a lot of people who truly felt that World War I would in fact be the war to end all wars. And so in that vein, in 1928, an agreement called the Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed between the United States and France. And what this agreement was, it basically stated that countries that sign on to this agreement pledged to renounce, that is to say reject, war as an instrument of national policy. In other words, countries agree that they will only fight defensive wars. They will never attack another country. They'll only defend themselves. And if all countries are only defending themselves and no one's attacking, then there won't be any war. That's the theory. Now, in retrospect, we look at this and think, well, gosh, that's so naive. That's never going to work. But people really genuinely thought maybe we had learned from World War I. The problem with this treaty is that there's no way of enforcing it, right? If a country violates this agreement, you can't go to war with them, so how do you actually enforce it? And in some ways, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, this attempt to ban war, kind of gives a lot of people a false sense of security and lulls us into complacency, and then World War II happens, and that's why you can see the 1939 candle, that's the year World War II begins. Notice how it's blowing up in the face here of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. All right, so this map shows us the countries that signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, agreeing again to only fight defensive wars going forward, and a lot of these countries have violated that agreement, obviously, since 1929. All right, one more thing, foreign policy, and then we'll get into the Great Depression. Speaking of trying to prevent war, and speaking of fighting only defensive wars, France, of course, think back to World War I. Germany had gone through Belgium, and they had nearly knocked France out of the war. France suffered hundreds of thousands of military casualties, and in the 1930s, France was kind of thinking about a future war with Germany, and they're hoping to make that war unlikely by building some very impressive defense works between France and Germany. This is known as the Maginot Line. Maginot Line. This is going to be an incredibly expensive, ambitious project that the French are going to spend 10 years building. And again, the goal is to protect against another German invasion. Now, usually when I show this map to students, they'll point out the fact that this Maginot Line is not complete. And the weak part up here, it's not strong. And that's true. There are a couple of reasons why the French went that route on building the strong defenses here and weak up here. Number one, of course, this is right there on the border with Germany, so it makes sense those are the strongest fortifications. Secondly, this was very expensive. They simply just didn't have enough resources to build the entire thing with strong defenses. Remember, this is during the Great Depression, which we're about to get to here in a moment. France just doesn't have the money. It's also a matter of time. The reason this construction ends in 1940 is not because it was finished. It was because that's when Germany actually invaded France. But this series of fortifications was, for its time, incredibly impressive and modern. Basically, you would have these like steel reinforced concrete bunkers and machine gun nests. This turret would actually, it's what they call the disappearing turret. It could raise from the ground, fire at the enemy, and then lower back down the ground so it can't be destroyed. This thing was widespread. There were all kinds of tunnels and even underground railroads connecting the different forts. I mean, this is really, really impressive. But what's going to happen is kind of what you would expect. The Germans in 1940 are just going to go around the teeth of the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line ultimately is going to fail to defend France. All right, let's now sow the seeds for the Great Depression by talking some economics here. So World War I, again, very, very costly, not just in terms of lives, but in terms of money. And European countries, even the ones who won the war, found themselves very deep in debt, mainly to the United States. Okay, you can see Britain, $4.2 billion in debt. France, 2.9, basically $3 billion worth of debt. And what that means is the United States came out of the war as the #1 economic power. And we were the country that was providing those loans and investment trying to rebuild Europe. Well, that's a good thing for us and Europe, assuming, of course, that nothing bad happens to America. So the reason this is so dangerous is when most of the world is relying on the continued prosperity of the American economy. If the American economy were to slow down or have some sort of crisis moment, basically the world economy would be like a house of cards that just collapses in and of itself. Now, in the 1920s, most of the 1920s anyways, the economy was doing very, very well under people like Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and later Herbert Hoover. But, the thing about economies are they rise and they fall. And the American economy, even though on the surface it looked very prosperous, there were some underlying problems. One of the problems was that America was incredibly efficient at producing stuff. More cars, refrigerators, clothes, everything you could, pencils, anything you can imagine. We were producing so much of it, but Americans just didn't have enough money to purchase all those goods. So what you're having is kind of a surplus of goods piling up, and Americans simply can't consume enough of the stuff that's being produced. The reason that's such a bad thing is it leads to a downward spiral. If Americans are not being paid high wages, they can't buy all that stuff, and so factories cut back their production. Well, if they're cutting back their production, they don't need as many workers, so workers are laid off. Workers who are laid off can buy even less stuff than before, and so cutbacks are cut back even more, which leads to more layoffs. And basically what you have is kind of like this economic death spiral, just heading towards the ground. Now, another issue is on the agricultural front, America's hurting as well. So America had become very efficient through new technologies to growing more and more crops. Huge farm surpluses were being produced. And the problem with that is Americans can only eat so much, and there's only so much grain you can sell overseas. And so the more you produce of something, if the demand can't keep up, the price will drop. And so prices begin to drop dramatically on foreign products in the 1920s. And remember, there are way more farmers in America in the 1920s than there are today. So this is a problem faced by millions of Americans of low prices. Now, to try to make up for lower crop prices, farmers tended to grow even more to try to make up the difference, which of course only makes the problem worse. And then there's also the issue of Mother Nature. I'm sure you've probably learned about this before, and if you haven't, you definitely will learn about it when you take American history. In the 1920s, this area out here in the West, in the plains, was kind of unusually wet in the sense that crops got plenty of water. And then about 1930, a drought starts that lasted basically 10 years. And this area dried out very, very quickly. What happened was the soil that's been now plowed and tilled and exposed to the sunlight bakes in the heat of the sun. It dries out, becomes this powdery dust. And the winds, and if you've ever been to the plains, you know there's kind of a constant wind blowing through here. That's going to pick up all that dust. And what we're looking at, of course, is the famous Dust Bowl. And these were known as black blizzards. They were these massive clouds of dust that could be hundreds of miles wide, could be a mile or two high, and they come rolling in and they just submerge an area in dust. It really did seem like it was the end of the world for a lot of these farmers. Okay, so before we get into the stock market crash and all the other stuff, just a quick review. We covered the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was an attempt to ban war, which failed. We looked at the Maginot Line, France's attempt to defend itself against German attack. That will also fail. And then we looked at some problems like overproduction and low wages in the United States in the 1920s. Now it's time for the famous stock market crash. But let's get some background on why the stock market crash happened in the first place. So the stock market was booming in the 1920s. It looked like the price of stocks was always going to go up, which means it's a safe bet. You invest $100 and you come back with $125, and it seems like it's easy money. And some people were so encouraged by this, they started to do some pretty risky investment schemes. One of these is buying stocks on margin. Now, what that means is you pay a small down payment to purchase a stock, and then you borrow the remainder so that you can purchase that stock. That may not make a lot of sense the way I just described it, so let me walk you through the numbers. Let's imagine there is a particular stock that you want to buy, and you're very confident it's going to go up in value, and the stock costs $10. You only have $5. So to purchase that stock, you're going to have to go borrow another $5 to get that $10 to buy the stock. Then the stock price goes up just like you expected it to. And at $15, you decide, that's about as high as it's probably going to go anyways. I'm going to go ahead and sell. So you do. You sell that stock at $15. You pay your $5 loan. You subtract the $5 you originally invested in the stock, and you have made a profit of $5. Okay, so you start with $5, and now you have $10. That's pretty awesome. This only works, though, if the price of stocks continue to go up and up and up. If they go down, this whole house of cards falls apart because people can't pay back their loans. And what happens is, in the very late 1920s, some people start to sell off their stocks because they're convinced that prices have gone too high. There's been what they call a bubble, and the bubble might burst. And so some people start to sell off their stocks. And then what happens is a gradual sell-off becomes this wild panic, because if you own a bunch of these stocks and the prices are going down, like, you want to go ahead and sell them before the price declines even further. And so this brings us to Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, when the bottom fell out of the stock market and it crashes. And you have people who, they had invested a lot of money in stocks, and stocks are only valuable if someone will buy them from you. If no one's willing to buy it, that money you've invested has basically disappeared. So you may have invested $1,000, and now your stocks are worth $25. You've lost $975. Okay, that's how that works. Now, this stock market crash has a bunch of ripple effects that go down the line. One of them is the fact that a lot of banks fail. And the reason they fail is they've made a lot of risky loans, some to investors and other people. And as soon as people can't pay back those loans, the banks, they go out of business. And when they go out of business, they would carry people's life savings down with them, because you had deposited money in that bank, the bank is out of business, and now you are just out of luck. And you can imagine the feeling of fear and disappointment and anger of people who had invested and who had deposited money in a bank, and then it was just gone. And there's literally nothing you can do about it. You can't sue the bank; it's out of business. And the bank hadn't done anything illegal according to the laws at the time. So banks fail, factories start to close down, stores are closing because no one's buying anything, so there's very low customer demand. Millions of Americans are thrown out of work. At its peak, about 1/4 of all Americans who were seeking work could not find them, and making it probably the highest unemployment rate rather in all of American history. And so a lot of people, they want a job, they just can't find one. And so we see an economy that had just been booming and growing in the 1920s, really completely start to fall apart in the 1930s. It's a very big reversal of fortunes. Now, the Great Depression that began in America spreads across the globe because international trade is very important, and countries begin. They're not trading as much anymore, so there's fewer products being sold, which means we need fewer workers, so unemployment rises. Countries raise tariffs to try to protect their businesses, and that only makes trade harder to happen, and so it just spreads across the globe. It's like an economic pandemic spreading across the globe. Now, how do we deal with that depression? That was the big question. And when the Great Depression began in 1929, our president was a man you may have never even heard of before. His name is Herbert Hoover. He's one of our, frankly, kind of forgettable presidents. He served only one term. And when he was elected in 1928, the economy was still strong, so he certainly was not expecting this. And he was of the opinion that the government really shouldn't interfere much in private business matters. He was very afraid of giving people direct assistance from the government, like in other words, giving people money from the government, because he felt that what would happen is that would hurt people's work ethic. Once they get addicted to that government help, that they'll never want to work ever again. They'll just stay at home and collect their government checks. So that's really what he feared. But when this goes on for years, people start to lose faith in Hoover and in the government. You may have heard of Hoovervilles before. These were basically tent cities of people who have been thrown out of work, thrown out of their house, and just trying to survive. And they called them Hoovervilles because they were blaming Hoover for their problems. So in 1932, President Hoover is running for re-election, and he gets destroyed in this election by the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, distant cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. And he argued a different strategy. Okay, so Hoover was reluctant to get the government involved, and Roosevelt is very much eager to use the power of government to fight the Great Depression. There is Franklin Roosevelt with his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, probably the most famous first lady in American history, really the first politically active first lady. By the way, the man and wife there, husband and wife rather, they were fifth cousins. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt was already a Roosevelt. She didn't have to change her last name when she got married to her fifth cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. And just to make it another connection here, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt in other words, that was Eleanor Roosevelt's uncle. So, anyhow, there is Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s, and you'll notice something about him that might seem to kind of conflict with what you know about him. He's standing. And what a lot of Americans know today that they didn't know back then was that FDR lost the ability to walk in 1921. He contracted polio, which is a virus, in 1939, and it left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. He was restricted to a wheelchair. But that's something he tried to hide as much as possible from the people because, given people's mindsets back then, they may not have voted for someone in a wheelchair because they would think that he's weak and he couldn't do the job. Now, when Franklin Roosevelt is elected, like all presidents, he gives an inaugural speech. And in his first inaugural speech, he famously said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And what he meant by that is if we just sit in the corner crying, then we'll never solve this problem. We've got to take action. We've got to get out there and try to solve this problem aggressively. And this is called the New Deal. The New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt's plan to end the Great Depression. This is going to have a lot of moving parts to it. One part is spending lots and lots of government dollars on what's known as public works. So you would have people planting trees and building bridges and building roads and building things in national parks and things. And they're doing this again, they're being employed by the government. And Franklin Roosevelt thought that if the government's helping these people with a paycheck now, they'll be buying more things, and factories will reopen, and eventually the government aid will kind of just siphon off. So you had organizations like the WPA, the CCC, the TVA, which is still very much with us. That's how we get electricity in this part of the country, the TVA, which again is a product of the New Deal. And in addition to that, the government agencies, other government agencies were established to help out farmers and to help out businesses, things like the AAA and the NRA, which is not the same NRA you might be familiar with from modern day. This has nothing to do with rifles. The government also does what Hoover had feared. They begin spending lots of money on public welfare and assistance programs, things like free school lunches for kids, Social Security. And Roosevelt is hoping that, again, these will create jobs, will start the recovery, and then the government can start kind of pulling back and not having to spend as much money on individuals, because those people will be back at work and the economy itself will start going again. He also puts into place some big regulations to try to tamp down on some of those stock market practices that made the stock market crash and the Great Depression more likely. These are still with us, things like the FDIC. What that did was it basically guaranteed people's bank deposits so that they would be confident in putting their money back in a bank and not just keeping it under their mattress or something like that. The FDIC is, again, still very much with us. But here's the thing about the Great Depression. When you look at it as a whole, it did not end the Great Depression. Okay? It does help individuals. It helps people, kind of get through a tough time. It helps ease some of the suffering. But it didn't end the Great Depression. In fact, some people think it actually made the Great Depression longer than it should have been through all this government interference in the economy. The thing that ends the Great Depression is World War II. When World War II rolls around in 1939 and Europe's at war, Americans are going to start going back to work to produce all the goods needed for a war. And then once we're in the war in full time in 1941, the Great Depression basically just kind of evaporates and it's gone. All right, that is it for Unit 6. And speaking of World War II and Unit 7, we are going to look at the rise of some of the dictators, people like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, that are going to be central to our look at World War II in just a little while. All right, that is it for Unit 6, guys.